citations, and some people were focused on what type of cancer, like breast cancer or kidney cancer, and some people were focused on aspects of cancer biology, but none of this was interwoven. It was all like disparate, siloed research that wasn't easy to make sense of. So one day, though, about 2007 roughly, I ran into this paper called The Hallmarks of Cancer, and it became the most cited paper in the field of cancer research. It has tens of thousands of views, I don't know, of citations. I don't know how many, but it's like the most cited paper. And it was really good because it helped me understand how these different pieces of cancer research related to one another, and that was super helpful for me because I was reading widely. Now remember, I'm not a scientist. I don't know anybody who is a scientist. I don't know anybody in the field of cancer. I'm just like reading in my private spare time. But for me, this was very instructive because it helped me start to see how things fit together. I emailed the scientist who wrote the paper and said, but there's stuff missing in here. What about the immune system? And what about the cancer tumor microenvironment? And they said, oh, we are working on another paper and that's coming. And ultimately, they did produce another paper in 2011, I think, so like 3 or 4 years later, which was this model, which included more areas of cancer research, and more recently they published this paper, which again is more recent. Now these diagrams won't mean anything to you because we're here to talk about neuroscience, but I want you to understand that there was a couple of people who are busily trying to say, how do all those pieces fit together? And that was really helpful for the field because people didn't know how their work in tissue invasion related to their work on the tumor microenvironment or whatever, because they weren't focused on collaborating, they were focused on figuring out what their little piece was about. And that created a kind of a world where the literature was hard to understand. I had an epiphany, sort of, if you want to speak of it that way, after figuring out what this framework looked like, that, oh, if I take this framework and I apply it to cancer therapy, it means something. We could talk about how to treat really difficult cancers if we understood all the dimensions holistically, as opposed to thinking about cancer therapy from a single silo. And I also had ideas about how cancer was caused, that if we looked at all the pieces simultaneously when we're exposed to, say, chemicals in the environment that we think are safe, how combinations of chemicals might be impacting these different areas that were related to one another, and that might impact how cancer is caused. And I started contacting scientists and saying, hey, what about this possibility if we think about these problems holistically? And they would say, yeah, but I am only focused on this piece, so I don't do that. And I'd say, yeah, but you wrote about it in your paper, and you said it was a problem. How come that's not getting solved? And they would say, well, nobody does that. Like, I do this piece. And so I said, okay, what if I did something? Now remember, I'm not a scientist and I don't have anything published. I'm not a PhD. I have a bachelor's degree and an MBA at the time. And they said, well, if you wanted to do something, sure, I'd be willing to help. And so suddenly I started getting a bunch of people who said the same thing, and I put together an advisory board, and from the advisory board, I built a project. I sent 40,000 emails to 40,000 cancer scientists, unsolicited, and I got 1,000 people who said they were really excited about the idea of the project and signed up. I took from the 1,000 people and I picked team leaders. I got a top-tier journal involved. I built 12 teams for each project, so 24 teams in total. And I brought them to Halifax for workshops where we workshopped it, and then we went away and we wrote publications, and we did synthesis in both projects. It was a success, and everybody said, this is an amazing project. We wouldn't normally collaborate with all these other people we normally compete with for grant money or whatever. And it was exciting, and this was a scope that we couldn't have imagined, and we think we did something important. So that was like a huge win for me personally at the time. I got a PhD by publication out of all the publications that we generated, and I co-authored many of the papers because I was basically in there telling them what the paper had to be shaped like to fit within the larger structure that we were trying to accomplish. when it was done, I started thinking about the problem that my professor had posed that led me to the field of affective neuroscience, and everything that I had read in the field of affective neuroscience told me that they were in the place where cancer research was before they came along with a model. Basically, everybody was in their own silo. There were all kinds of different areas of research, and I couldn't find anything in the literature to tell me how emotions and feelings were related to one another. Where is that model? Does anybody know of a model that can bring everything under one roof? Because the literature just seemed like a mess from my perspective as an observer. I'm not in this field, remember. I'm a lay person, essentially. Okay, I have a PhD now, but I'm still new to this field, and I couldn't figure out how to bring pieces together. One thing that bothered me was I would find whole labs that were set up to study optimism or pessimism or guilt or social emotions or whatever, the self, some aspect of the self. And I was thinking, okay, who decides at what lab which piece of the pie that they're going to take on in research? Like, where's the list of emotions, or where's the list of feelings? Because there were some models in the field about what were the emotions and feelings that people were talking about. But I was thinking there's more than what I can see. I could only see, I don't know, a couple of dozen different topic areas. I'm scratching my head saying, I want to know where the whole list is. Well, no list existed, so I started building a list. I started going to every website I could find and gathering lists of feelings and trying to see how many there were. Anybody have a guess as to how many feelings we express or articulate in our language, in any language? Give me a number, anybody. Nobody. How many? 50. Okay, anybody else? Upper limit. What do you think? Okay, so I wanted to know. I went to every website that I could, and I came up with less than 100. Okay? And I thought, okay, is that the list? I now have the list. Do I have the list? I don't know. So I started just going through these things and saying, do we care? Like, are they relevant for neuroscience? Why do I want to know? Well, I want to know because people are setting up their whole lab with a fMRI machine and doing scanning of people's brains based on like one word that's some feeling that people express that they have, and they're like, I'm going to specialize in that. And I want to know, well, if we studied the 100 words, would we have the whole picture? Because nobody seems to know what the big pie looks like, and I wanted to know what the pie looked like. So I started looking at these. Now, these are different words. Some of them over here on the left are like things to do with our body, our physiology. Some of these things are about what we think about ourselves. Some of these things are about our social relationships. Like, there's a lot of different feelings that we express in language. Are they even relevant for neuroscience? Some of them are, some of them aren't. I don't know. So I hired a Russian supercomputer programmer. This is pre-Russia-Ukraine invasion. For $50 on some platform on the internet. I found a guy in Russia who was capable of doing computational linguistic search, and he scanned petabytes of data and all these English language corpora, and he came back and he said, here's your list. It's 5,000 feeling words. 5,000? What does that list represent? I had no idea. I'm like, I have the biggest, as far as I know, I have the biggest list of feeling words in the world. Does anybody care? Does it matter? I don't know. I spent 2 summers with 5,000 words in a spreadsheet trying to organize them. It did not go well. But I had a lot of feeling words, and I was thinking, okay, there's something here that would be helpful if we were trying to figure out how emotions and feelings are connected to human behavior and the neuroscience that we have around emotions and feelings so far. Let's agree there's probably a lot of synonyms in the list, so we could get rid of those. But does that make the list? What if it's just 1,000? What if there were just 1/5 of that. It's still a huge number. And what does that represent for the field? This is the question that I asked. Now, interestingly enough, I just finished the 2 cancer science projects, and that was a huge success. And I said, hey, I could use the same model for neuroscience. I'm going to go recruit a whole bunch of people in neuroscience in different fields and bring them together on teams. I'm going to get a top-tier journal. I'll build an advisory board to formulate the question, and I'm going to see what we come up with. Let's put them in a room and make them mix it up and see if we can come up with something that's helpful. That's the idea. Essentially a hallmarks of cancer paper, but for effective neuroscience. That was the goal. Now, these are the areas that I came up with. This isn't like a perfect framework by any stretch. These were areas where I saw a lot of research happening. So let's bring people together in the big areas where a lot of research is happening, and let's put them in a room and force them to reconcile how their research is connected to each other and see if we can come up with something useful. At the same time, we redid my Russian supercomputer programmer guy's research, and we did a more formal version of that with somebody in London who was quite capable, and we did a proper research job. And we still came up with 3,664 word census. Those are feeling words with a definition that goes with them. And synonyms were identified, so we could get rid of synonyms. We didn't. We kept them in a single data set. They're online. They need to be still organized and sorted, but they're there. And it was interesting to go through them, and we did go through them, and we kind of got a sense of what was in there. So I'll share some of that with you. But the fact is, there are a lot of feeling words that we have, like thousands. Now, we did the project. All the teams came together. Dr. Basato was on one of the teams. His team published a paper, so did 11 other teams. And then we did a synthesis with all the scientists in the project. And we asked them to try and bring together, how do these pieces fit together? And it was a frustrating exercise because the pieces that we had didn't seem to fit together. In fact, Daniela Schiller, who was the lead author, and Alessandra Yu, who was her postdoc who worked on this project with her as the lead authors on the paper, were frustrated because the pieces that we had given them from all the teams didn't lend themselves to a synthesis that really had a good foundation. And so it was a bit of a struggle for them, and we blew every deadline with our publisher we could possibly have in getting it done. And at some point they said, we're starting again. We're going to first principles, and we're going to start again. And I want to show you the framework that they developed and tell you why they developed it. And then I want to talk about what that means or how it might be useful. They said, we're going to use a teleological approach. What does that mean? What's the purpose of the human organism? Our goal is to build a framework that we can put all of this effective neuroscience research in where nobody is left behind. We want an umbrella that puts everybody under the same framework. First part of it is that we need a model that talks about the fact that the human, as any organism, needs to ensure its own basic viability. It needs to sustain itself. So that has to be at the foundation. Life, if you will. How do we stay alive? Okay, that's at the beginning. We need to be able to execute operations in the world. That's part of a complex organism existing in an environment that is complex, is the ability to do things, to move about and operate and do things in its own sustenance of life, the ability to move around. And then to do things that are relevant. We need to be able to take actions that are relevant to our survival. We have to be able to discern what's relevant, and we have to be able to act in ways that are relevant to ensure our own viability. And finally, we have to be able to entertain abstraction. We have to be able to think, some cases, years ahead, or about possibilities, or using our imagination, different ways in which things might play out. We have to do scenario building and planning and all of those kinds of things. That's part of the fundamentals of what we have to be capable of being able to do. Now, with that said, we have different kinds of affective concerns. We have physiological concerns, the kinds of things that are related to our body. Basic things like, do we have enough food, water, air? Is the temperature acceptable? Can I survive in this environment? These are basic things that we have as affective concerns. And we have operational concerns related to us accomplishing the things that we are needing to do in that environment. We also have assessments of our trajectory. Are we within our comfort zone? And this is a concept I'm going to expand on, and it's an important concept. But the question is, are we at a place that we're comfortable? And that is really essential when we start talking about feelings and emotions. I'll explain that in a bit. And is this the best trajectory for us? Is this optimal? Could we be doing something that was better for us overall? Should we be making major changes to our approach, more like strategy? Are we making the best approach in terms of our optimization of the way we're moving? Affective concerns have what we refer to in the literature as valence and arousal. We have things that are very positive, things that are very negative. That's what we refer to as valence. And we have level of excitement. And this probably has its roots in the way we measured things in the lab. Do we have somebody who's excited or not excited? Very crudely, but essentially that we're assessing whether or not this is happening at a high level of arousal or a low level of arousal. We refer to those as features of affective experiences. So what are affective experiences? Well, these included things that we articulate as feelings, which I gave you some examples of, but also non-articulated feelings. There are things we can't put words to, where you say, how do you feel? And you say, I can't describe it. Generally, there is a positive or a negative component to it, but they may not be something that you can put into words because it's an experience you're having. That's included. It's not just things that we say. We also have emotional feelings, and I want to draw a distinction between the terms emotion and feelings because they're often used interchangeably in some literature. Generally speaking, we think of an emotion that is something that has an autonomic system-level component to it. Think of fear. We can have unconscious feelings of fear. You can reproduce this in the lab. You can create fear survival circuitry in the brain that someone is not conscious of or even aware of. You can watch their brain react as you show them fearful images, for example, and the person, if you do it fast enough, and the person has no sense that it's even occurred. And then we have feelings that are related to anxious feelings or fearful feelings that are more cognitive that could be later when we actually understand what those fear feelings are from, or if we assess using logic and cognitive abilities that we should be fearful, we can have fear component. But the point is that feelings are a component of an emotion. So an emotion is the whole structure and the whole activity, and it has a feeling component to it. So feelings and emotions are not the same word, all right? We can also have feelings related to things like being hungry, sometimes referred to in the literature as drives, or being thirsty, or needing something that is not an emotion, but we have feelings. And I want to talk about the similarity of those valenced affective experiences because they are all valenced experiences. They have positives and negatives, and they are all affective in the way we think of an affective experience, but they're not all emotions. So there are some are emotions, but some are not. Think about aesthetics. We have things that are visually positive and things that are visually negative. To the extreme, we can have something you could look at and it could be horrible, and something you could look at and it can be beautiful. The same thing with smells, with tastes, with sounds, even with your bodily movement, being dizzy versus being stable or seasick because of motions that are unacceptable to your balance system. We have a whole bunch of sensory systems that give valenced sensory experiences that don't fit under the umbrella of feelings, but they are valenced affective experiences. Okay, so the human affectome then encompasses all of those valence affective experiences holistically under the same umbrella. This is kind of the diagram that's in the paper that we produced, this teleological approach, which sort of provides a high level. We have concerns from physiological to the immediate to the distal, less immediate concerns that we might have, and concerns about our trajectory and whether or not we're on the best trajectory optimization. To think about the way in which we might categorize different kinds of feelings that we might experience, and that those feelings can be described as having either a positive or negative valence, and potentially be described as accompanied by a certain degree of arousal. So that's the sort of capstone paper that we created this framework around thinking about these things. Now, you're thinking, so what? What do we do with that information? Well, first of all, I want to say that this is the first time that we've actually tried to create a framework that puts everybody under the same umbrella. And that's important in the field of research because the way in which all those disparate areas of effective research connect to one another is not obvious. Now I want to go a little further and I want to elaborate on some other parts of the paper and give you my perspective on kind of where this takes us. And I want you to think about from your own perspective in your own work. So I'll just jump past this because these are just a quick summary of what's in the paper, and you'll get these slides later so you can have it, but those are the areas that I just talked about. But I want to focus for a minute on the term comfort zone and what that means. Now, Jaak Panksepp, who was one of the people involved in this project, was the person who wrote the first effective neuroscience textbook, I think, that I know about. It was my first sort of foray into effective neuroscience. He's one of the pioneers. There's others that preceded him and that were his contemporaries, and he passed during this project. But he talks about the comfort zone, and what he said is that the organism as a whole has, the human in this case, has an area where they're comfortable and they have intolerable amounts of sort of depletion and overflow. And if you think about it like something basic like food, at the extreme we get very hungry, that would be depletion. And if we ate and ate and ate until we had too much food, there would be a point at which we'd say that's enough. And the same thing applies with temperature. We could be too cold where it's like, this is intolerable, I need more heat, but at some point if you gave more heat, there would be too much heat and it would be unsustainable. And the same thing applies for water and a number of other things. And I want to talk about what those other things are. But the point is that we have an area where we're comfortable and an area where we're not. And often when we're in deficit or in surplus, we have to fix the problem. It's not okay to be in temperatures that are minus 40 with no clothes on. Suddenly we are too cold and something needs to be done about it, and that could be a priority. Or it might be as simple as I need to sleep, right? I can't do anything, don't talk to me until I get some sleep because I'm not in a place where I can operate. And when we get in a place where something needs to be given a priority, that becomes everything that matters to us. Now, outside we call these stress areas. These are stressors. When we're in a place that we're not comfortable, we get stressed. And this is the way we use it in common language. Say, I'm not comfortable here, I'm stressed. And stress comes from a lot of different places. We know that. And I want to talk about how stress is common amongst a lot of different areas of concern. So here's just a quick summation of different areas of concern that we have with our basic physiological needs: food, water, adequate amounts of air to breathe, the temperature that we're in, the space that we're in, whether or not we have enough adequate muscle power or strength remaining, depending on what we're doing, or whether or not we're tired or not. Each one of these is an area where we have a comfort zone, where we're okay in one place, and in another, we're not okay, and something needs to be done about it. There's many of these, we have 3,664 words of feelings that we express that are valenced experiences that extend way beyond this into all kinds of other areas. How we feel about ourselves, how we feel about our social relationships, how we feel about our connection to God, culturally, what's okay, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. All of these areas are things where you say, I feel uncomfortable in this situation because I was brought up differently. And we could have, as you could imagine, many different culturally built, constructed areas of concern that could put us in a place where we're uncomfortable. And is that the same? Are we talking about the same thing? A minute ago, Leroy, you were talking about being hungry. Now you're talking about whether I'm comfortable culturally or with my self-image. Are those the same things? Let me get there. I want to talk about that, okay? Now, our model in the paper talks about, in general, that there's something called the comfort zone, but this is also an allostatic model, not homeostatic. Homeostatic is we always revert to the same set point, right? Our body temperature, 37, I don't even know what our body temperature is, 37.1 or something. Whatever our body temperature is, your body's always working to get us back to the same set point. In our comfort zones that we have in all these areas, we can adapt. We can change them. My comfort zone in temperature is I might be able to stand a certain amount of cold and a certain amount of heat. But if I lived in the tropics for a decade, my comfort zone in heat may change. How much cold I can tolerate and how much heat I can tolerate might be different if I lived in the Arctic, okay? How hungry can I get? I might be in crisis at a certain level of hunger in my current incarnation, but if I said I'm going to get really good at being hungry and I'm going to go days and days and days without hunger, I could probably train myself to be better. Think about deep sea divers or those free divers who can go 8 or 9 minutes without air. They've trained their body to be able to spend a massive amount of time underwater without air. They're changing what's comfortable for them in ways that wouldn't be normal for us. And that's an allostatic model, one in which our comfort zone might evolve in different areas that we have to manage within a comfort zone in each area. Okay? All right. The question that I'm going to ask you is, how do we manage hundreds, thousands of areas of concern simultaneously? This is 200, just to give you an idea. So that's 200. I told you that there's probably more than 2,000. There's 10 times this many areas of concern that your brain is managing in parallel at any one time, all the time. Does this matter for neuroscience? Well, that's what I want to talk about, right? So first of all, I want to say, let's just agree that there has to be some priority setting in the human brain. We have to be able to set priorities if we're managing hundreds of areas of concern at a time. I have to pee. I have to go to the bathroom. I'm okay right now. I'm good. In an hour from now, I'm going to be like, I need to go to the bathroom. And pretty soon, it's going to be, get out of my way. I have to go to the bathroom. It's, do not talk to me about anything else. I will punch you. If you stand in the door, I have to go use the bathroom. Is that true for everything? It's true for a lot of things, okay? Think about what happens at some level of hunger or sleep deprivation or being in an environment with too much noise. And at some point you're like, I need to get some peace and quiet. And it becomes your sole priority to fix it, okay? You have to have a way to set priorities. These things are cumulative. Think about what they did to the prisoners in Guantanamo. They gave them no sleep, right? Make them tired, make them hungry, scare them, play horrible music, show them things that are abhorrent to them. load it on. Let's stack up all the stresses that we can possibly stress them with, and hopefully we can break them. I mean, this is an awful thought, but this is humanity. We're a tough species. But the fact is that we know that we can accumulate stressors. And these could be normal stressors that people face in life, okay? The fact is they accumulate. And the ones that are in deficit or in surplus that need to be addressed, they become priorities that people have to deal with if they're going to function. They need to get those things resolved. So look, on a day-to-day basis, we manage hunger. It happens, we fix it. We manage sleep. We're tired, we sleep. We manage water consumption. We manage stability in our social environment. We manage our own fight with our self-image being adequate. We manage all of those things individually, collectively, to keep them in a place where we're okay. One of the problems we have is that the user interface isn't very good, right? So you have a client, a patient, if you will, who says, I feel depressed. And maybe it takes hours and hours and hours of discussion to dig down to find out what it is that's causing the problem. They can't pinpoint the problem. They just know what's happening at the top level, right? I put here affective states with the plural S because we've got tons of areas that have to be managed and they only have one reading. I'm sad. Or I've been sad for the last 2 weeks and I don't know what's causing it. And we have to dig underneath to try and figure out what it is that's going on, right, out of all those areas. What's the neurobiology that supports this? So what, right? What do we know about the human system? Well, to start with, let's agree that we have to have a system that provides incentives for us to be in our comfort zone and disincentives for us to be in places where we shouldn't be that threaten our viability, okay? Now I'm moving from what we wrote in our paper to beyond. So the paper gets us to a framework that's a big umbrella that talks about these areas of concern, takes everybody in effective neuroscience, says we're all focused on understanding the human mind and how these things are related to one another, that it's an allostatic model, that we work on comfort zones, that we have different areas of concern. That's all in the paper. I want to talk about this bit about priority setting. To me, that's an intuitive thing. There's not a lot of science on priority setting, not that I'm aware of. So just bear with me now, because I'm going to push us maybe to a little about where I think we need to get to, so that you can see where this takes us from a clinical standpoint, etc. Okay, we know we have one reward system. This is well established in the brain. We've got a reward system that consists of two components, wanting and liking. This is neurohormonally supported. This is supported by systems within the brain. One is the motivation to obtain a reward. Now, if you go in the literature and say what's been done, it's like rats and food, or mice and mazes, or humans and things that they need, that we deprive them of. And we have to be careful because we're not allowed to deprive humans of too much to get it past, review. So there's only so much we can test, but we are testing to see whether or not our assumptions about the reward systems in the mammals, that the rats and mice that we test, is the same as in humans. And we know that there is a system in human brain that motivates you to obtain things and gives you pleasure when you receive the things that you need. So dopamine sits at the heart of our wanting network, right? We know the mechanisms in the brain that are related to this. We know that dopamine increases arousal, it inspires seeking and searching and goal-directed behavior, right? Which is why cocaine is so powerful, okay? And people recognize that this is important. Neuroscientists know this is important. We've got examples of showing it's important. It's the only reward system that I know of in our brain. So I'm saying to you, we have a single reward system. We have a pleasure system. It's but sorry, I didn't mention serotonin, but serotonin is important in reward processing. I'll point that out. That our normal system for seeking and getting rewards is supported by serotogenic signaling and serotonin. And proper levels of serotonin are important for basic normal function of reward processing. Now we have a pleasure system, which is the reward we get when we get the thing that we're after. And that's the foundation of that is opioids, endogenous opioids. We have our own system for creating opioids and giving it as a reward. That's pleasurable. And our body, our central nervous system, knows when to dispense opioids when a reward has been achieved. Just like it knows how much dopamine to give in this wanting network, if I can jump back a slide, as you get closer to the reward, your body generates more dopamine and ramps it up and says, you're getting closer, keep going. Okay, so we have our own internal dispensing system for opioids, which tells us that's what you were after. Perfect. You did what you needed to do. And this doesn't just apply to one area. This applies to multiple things that we've done in the neuroscience literature to show when this system is invoked. Oxytocin is important in particular as it relates to rewards that are related to anything to do with social. Okay, and there's good literature on how important oxytocin is in terms of us finding pleasurable things that are related to things that are positive socially. So that's an important part of our reward system. GABA, we know, is related to anxiety and stress, and having the right amount of GABA, which is an inhibitory neuromolecule, having the right amount of GABA keeps us in a place where we can appreciate the pleasure associated with a reward. Once we get to a point where GABA is telling you this is a stressful situation where there's anxiety, your priorities change. You can't appreciate the pleasure associated with a reward because your system is ramping up for something that you should be fearful of. So GABA levels are important to maintain the right level of reward appreciation, which is focused on fixing the things that you need to fix to make sure that all of those areas of concern are in the right comfort zone. And lastly, we have endocannabinoids, which are the shutoff for your stress system. You know about the stress axis. I'm going to talk about the stress axis in a minute. There's only one stress axis, the HPA axis. And the endocannabinoids are the shutoff for the stress axis, which is no surprise. I can go smoke a joint and my stress goes down. Even if the stressors are still there, it's a shutoff of our stress system. So those endocannabinoids, endogenous endocannabinoids in our system, have to be at the right level for us to be able to appreciate rewards. So all of those neurohormones, neurotransmitters are important in us being in the right place to be able to appreciate rewards that we're currently seeking. I'm going to jump here and talk briefly about the stress axis. So what do we do about those things that we're disincentivized from? The things that we shouldn't be, making sure that we don't go hungry because it threatens our viability, or that we don't go without water. Well, those are areas of stress. And the stress axis basically sets us up to address an issue. So when you get stressed, your body says, oh, there's a priority that needs to be dealt with here. And the stress axis generates a bunch of cortisone from the adrenal gland, which turns into cortisol, which turns into cortisone in our system. And it prioritizes things like large muscles and slows things like digestion. So basically you have energy and focus to focus on what needs to get addressed right away. Now, we know chronic stress creates a problem because you can't subvert the system all the time. This is really just so that you have a priority that needs to address, and it says, your body says, you're stressed now, so you have extra energy to go focus on whatever you need to deal with to get you back in a place where you need to be. Otherwise, your viability as an organism will be threatened. Okay, single reward system, single stress system. Now we have displeasure or disincentives. Now, if you go look in the literature, it's less obvious. There appears to be less obvious network. We use pain and suffocation, or the dyspnea, I'm sorry, I always get that wrong, the lack of oxygen, as ways to simulate somebody who is has displeasure, but an actual displeasure network in the brain is more distributed in nature. We have the insula that processes unpleasantness. Disgust, for example, shows up there. And the ventral pallidum, which acknowledges or recognizes what are supposed to be aversive stimuli. They drive avoidance behavior and place aversion. Okay, so we have some mechanics in the brain that are related to displeasure. So think about it. We have a single system for incentivizing, rewarding, a single system for stress in general, and a single system-ish for disincentives or aversive behavior. Now, I'm going to talk about 3 negative emotions and how they relate to this idea. This managing everything within our comfort zone. The first one is anxiety and fear. There's not good literature on what causes fear. You will get people that list, these are the things that we are fearful of. But what I will tell you is that if you look at all these areas of concern holistically, everything from those physiological areas of concern, a deficit in any one which could kill you, things that are related to our self-image, things that are related to our social relationships, things that could be, if they go horribly wrong, could leave you in crisis emotionally, okay? These are things that we get fearful of, all of them. So those hundreds of areas of concern that we have, all of them can drive fear. We also have sadness. And this is a state that we're in when we're not in our comfort zone. And again, it relates to all of those areas of concern, hundreds of them. And we also, and if we end up in a prolonged state where we can't deal with the things that are making us sad, we call it depression. That's basically a trajectory of sadness that won't go away, that we have to tease apart and figure out what's going on underneath, because it could be many different variables. We know that. And lastly, we have anger. And again, if you go in the anger literature, there's a lot of description about what anger is. And there isn't anger circuitry in the brain, but we all know it as a reflexive, potentially explosive response to something. And I would like to say that it's a response to any time that you get set back or pushed into those areas that you're uncomfortable in, that are threaten your viability. In any one of those hundreds of areas, it's a reaction to fix whatever caused the problem. That could be anger at yourself. It could be anger at the circumstances. It could be anger at someone or something else. But that explosive reaction is related to you being put in a place where any one of those hundreds of areas of concern are in either deficit or surplus, such that your viability is threatened. So, does that mean there are only 3 emotions? No. There are lots of things we'll talk about all of them, but what I'm telling you is if you take those thousands of words that I gave you, which describe areas of concern, areas of social concern, area of self-image or self-worth or self-understanding, things that are related to your own physiology, things that are related to your actions in the world, how good you are at things that you do, whether you accomplish the things that you set out to do, whether you feel like you have purpose in life. All of those areas of concern, all of them fit into this same idea where we have a comfort zone where we're okay, and then when we feel like we're in deficit or in surplus and we are not okay. And they all drive the same systems that we have to manage them to a place where we are okay. We have a reflective system which allows us to think backwards on previous times when we experienced something similar. We need that, of course, for viability, so we don't forget the last time we were in crisis and what we did about it. And our most negatively valenced experiences are the ones that are the most memorable, in comparison with positively valenced experiences that are less memorable. No matter how pleasurable they were, it's the negatively valenced ones that we remember most. And there's good literature on this and good research on this. And we also have a mirror neuron system. We are a herd species. We are a social species. We travel in groups together. We have our own social networks that we build. And we have empathy. And we have the ability to invoke all of those same systems in ourselves in watching the experience of somebody who is close to us or somebody we care about. So what does that look like? Well, it means that those hundreds of areas of concern that I told you about, if not thousands, which are all being managed in parallel simultaneously, are essentially drawing on the same systems. Now, this is actually, intuitive, but it's not proven in the literature. This is not the result of decades of me working in the lab. This is me telling you where I think we are going to end up. We have a framework now that helps us understand these areas of concern as all being related to one another. We have a way of understanding feelings as being different from emotions, or at least a component of an emotion, but that feelings also apply to all kinds of other things that we wouldn't necessarily refer to emotions. If you go in the literature, it's a little messy, so some people call feeling alone a social emotion. But my point is that all of these things can be thought about in terms of where our comfort zone lies and what happens when we feel like we're outside of a comfort zone, either cognitively or through survival circuits like fear, which tell us we're in trouble. So whether it's autonomically, like disgust, which jumps up at you, or it's something that you think, oh, in a year from now I'm going to be dead because climate change is going to flood my house and I'll be in it or something. But doesn't matter where those thoughts come from, whether they are coming from a system that tells you you've got a problem, or it comes from your cognitive structures where you anticipate you're going to have a problem, the same systems are being invoked. What does that mean from a behavior standpoint? Well, it means that for all those things that are going well, we build routines, right? We do these things repeatedly. We go to the grocery store. We get water. We have personal relationships. We go to the gym. We work on our own image. We go on social media, whatever, but we do things that we think are satisfying those aspects of our well-being that need servicing. We have comfort zone exploration. I'm currently not comfortable with heights, but I'm going to try hang gliding because I think that I'm going to push the boundaries a little bit on what I'm okay with. This is the allostatic model that says we can decide I'm going to be a free diver and I'm going to be able to hold my breath for 10 minutes, or I'm going to run a marathon. I'm going to push the boundaries. Somebody in the last talk I gave said, what about people who like pain? And I said, that's pushing the boundaries. It's somebody who says, I know that there's pain and that I should be aversive to it. I'm going to see how much pain I can take. That's okay. That's pushing the boundaries on what we're comfortable with and creating a comfort zone that we can operate in. And we feel stronger when our comfort zone expands. When a baby is born, the comfort zone is very narrow. As soon as they're the least bit hungry, they cry. By the time the kid is 10 years old, they only cry occasionally when they're hungry, or they get angry when they're hungry. Hangry, right? You've heard that term probably. Hungry and angry. Happens coincidentally, when you're hungry, you get angry because you're blaming somebody for something, but it's really just because you're hungry. And if you give your kid a granola bar, they get better. Okay? So we've got comfort zone exploration and optimization. People change what they're doing in life. I think this is not good enough. I can do more. I can do better. I'm going to do it with less work. I'm going to take an easier path, or I'm going to do it with more work. But they change what they do to fit whatever goals they're trying to achieve. And all that goal setting and all those things that people are trying to get better at is found within that huge framework of language I told you about. All that stuff about how good you are at something and whether or not you have a purpose and whether or not you are doing well or competing with somebody else, whether you're feeling like you're winning or whatever. All that, all those feelings encompass all that we do to interact with the environment, our social relationships, our ideas with self. They're all in there, and there's a comfort zone for each one of them. On the stress side, what are the things that we're in crisis about, right? Which may be from I'm a little bit hungry and I need to get some food, or to I'm going to die if I don't get air soon because I'm underwater and I need to get to the surface, or I'm going to drown. All those things here, we get emotional behaviors that accompany them, the ones that I talked about in particular. Avoidance behaviors in general. I don't want to do anything that puts me in that situation. And when we are in that situation, we get people who are focused on addressing the things that are priorities to them because they are in crisis, or they're going to be in crisis, or they're starting to be outside their comfort zone, and they know they're going to be in crisis when the goal is to bring each one of these things into some sort of allostatic balance, if you will. There we go.
Hi, Professor Lowe. Thanks for the lecture. I think I have more questions than word for feelings to ask you, but I'm going to focus in one specific one. I'm going to read my question because my English is not that good. So, you talked about the list of feelings, and I'm thinking about the basic list that Jack concept brought us concerning bodily feelings and the 7 basic emotional feelings. Through a very empirical basis, not so much focusing on our description of feelings, but understanding how does those feelings arouses from the brainstem through deep brain stimulation. And I'm also thinking about the works of Mark Soames, that I believe that has been trying to put a lot of those pieces together. So I would like to ask you, how do you evaluate these works as a starting point? You know, where do you think that they are behind of our concerns? And I ask that with very interest because I do believe that the effort you are investing is a very essential one. And listening to your lecture, I thought that there's kind of a gap between how those feelings, those basic feelings arouses, and how they are cognitively read.
So, yeah, okay, first of all, thank you for the question. Very good one. And I want to emphasize that we know that the articulated feelings that I'm describing aren't necessarily tied directly to dedicated neurocircuitry that is connected to each one of these hundreds of areas of concern. And a lot of the early work that has been done. I'm going to use Joe Ledoux specifically on fear because he's the person who's been most vocal for the last couple of decades on not to conflate the language we use around anxiety and fear feelings that we experience with what he calls survival circuitry, which is related to the fear system, that capital F-E-A-R, the fear survival circuitry that is invoked when our body is threatened, okay? Because his point is that the survival circuitry that is invoked may be we may be unaware of it. It can happen in a subconscious level. It can cause certain points of arousal, neurochemistry to change. Basically, you become fearful even though you cognitively haven't caught up. And he draws, you know, little circuit diagrams that show what the system is doing versus our cognitive structures, which are informed separately, and we may develop a conscious awareness with feelings of fear later. And his point is that the two things are not the same. Now, I want to use that as an example because I think it's a good way to think about this in general. I'm not saying that we have hundreds of areas of concern and dedicated neural circuitry for all those areas of concern. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, I'm saying the reverse. Trying to think not simplistically because I don't want to oversimplify, but think about what we know for sure. We know we only have one stress axis. To my knowledge, there aren't multiple stress axes, and we know that many things can invoke that same axis. When we're under stress, we talk about it in a general way. We know the stress axis is invoked. We only have one way of shutting the stress axis system off. It's neurochemistry that essentially says, okay, you've had enough stress axis now, you're not needed anymore. We only have one reward system that I'm aware of. We only have certain parts of the brain that we've been able to identify that are connected with aversive behaviors and negative stimuli and things that are telling us not to be in this place anymore, because your brain is basically paying attention to places where you're getting yourself in trouble. And so I'm saying we've got hundreds of areas of concern that are being managed using common singular systems as opposed to hundreds of areas of concern that all have their own neurocircuitry. Now, I'm also saying, though, that there is some circuitry for some things. We have a system that tells us when we need to use the bathroom to urinate or defecate, and there are systems associated with that, like full or empty, right? Hunger systems that and we know there's neurohormonal chemistry related to being hungry, and we know that we know when we're hungry and when we're full. And some of those systems might be driven by neurochemistry, and some might be driven by physical systems that are literally, you've reached the limit. Those systems are separate, managing each of those individual areas of concern. It's easier to pick on the physiological systems because we know some of those systems are and how they work. We know how the kidney works, we know how the bowel works, and we have done enough research to know how those things connect with the central nervous system. So those are easy, low-hanging fruit, but there's physiological systems connected, but they're feeding the central nervous system, which is managing them with the same central rewards and disincentives and aversive approach, avoidance kind of systems that are allowing us to know what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing. Now I'm saying let's carry the same idea across to all these other areas that are more constructed, maybe socially constructed. Now, some might, I say socially constructed, but let's agree that oxytocin, there's good research now that we have neurohormonal chemistry that's related to relationships that tells us when certain kinds of things are important. Let's not forget sexual activity, which has its own separate systems for pleasure, which help us understand when we're doing what we're supposed to be doing as a species, right? So we have separate physical systems for some of these things, but you can also imagine that if I grew up in a certain culture where certain things I think are acceptable about who I am, what I look like, how I behave, all of those things have comfort zones, and all of those things have areas where I am absolutely not comfortable here. And we talk about people who have pain, right? We talk about I'm in pain over what's happened. It's not the same as somebody sticking you with a needle, but we have research that talks about pain that people experience that is not associated with a nerve that you have pinched, but rather a cognitive structure that you've evoked that taps into the same circuitry. So can we talk about all those other areas of concern, some of which are socially constructed or culturally constructed or constructed on our understanding of what we should be doing or how we should look, etc., and think about them exactly the same way? Why should we assume that when we feel like we're in a state where my self-image has been destroyed based on something that happened, that I'm not evoking the same circuitry which feeds our normal incentive and disincentive systems that are in our body. Fair enough? I'll go back to Jaak Panksepp because you talked about those bits of research that he did, and I would say that all of them are under the same umbrella. You know, he talks about seeking. We have a system we know that does that. He talks about fear, all those other, right? Those basic pieces are all in there. We're not saying that in this framework we've created that anything that's being done right now in effective neuroscience doesn't belong. We're saying it all belongs. The question is, how do we think about it in a way that allows us to make sense of it? Many of you deal in your own practice with patients who have, in some cases, neurobiological problems, in some cases, psychiatric problems. And I guess what I would say is, when things are all in disarray, it's messy. My question is, what does not messy look like? Do we know? Right? Where's the template of what normal looks like? Because if we're going to talk about how somebody is not normal, shouldn't we know what normal is in some sort of holistic, coherent way? And I would say that if you just were to survey the literature right now and tried to find that model, it doesn't exist. We have a lot of siloed research in all these areas. It's there. I'm trying to draw it into a picture that allows us to understand what a basic model looks like and how people's central nervous system is allowing them to do what they do and how that translates into behavior. And then so that when we talk about somebody who isn't in that situation, that we can talk about what's in disarray and how it should be working. That make sense? Sure. Okay, thank you.
And before we continue, thank you so much, Professor. And before we continue with our questions, I'll ask Professor Buzzetto to come, please, to give his commentary on this lovely presentation. Professor Geraldo, as everyone knows, is our full professor, and he's the current president of the Institute of Psychiatry's Board of Directors. Of course, yeah.
Leroy, thank you very much once again for your interest in visiting us today. It's been a great day and a great lecture. I guess the most useful thing I could say and propose is something different from the actual framework, because I mean it's been a huge work. There is a series of papers. You managed to get so many people involved in it, and it was a great pleasure, I'm sure, for all of us. It was a great pleasure to work under your leadership. And because we are here now together, I think what would be best is to try and understand your experience, understand where you are now, and what we can learn from that. And you have to correct me if I get it wrong. I see you as something that is, for example, different from me. I'm someone who was grown in academia. I'm a professor, as other people here are, and we have our PhD students, our research programs, our research labs, and we do our administrative duties, and we stay in academia. And we know it's great to see that nowadays we understand that academia shouldn't be working in isolation from the rest of society. We should be exploring the ideas of smart people who are around us, that are motivated to do research, the patients, other stakeholders, people from other services that can co-create research progress with us. And my feeling is that you are someone who actually came from outside with your own motivations and your ideas and proposal of models, and you succeed very well. And I keep questioning myself whether you got bitten by the bug and you would place yourself nowadays as one of us, as an academic, or you are now moving to different projects and you see that relating to academics and staying from your perspective, from where you came, what's your position now? Did I get it right?
So maybe I would say this. I didn't come to the project for cancer research, for example. I had no interest in the academic component. It was like, what can we do to make a difference? Is there anything I have to add here? And when I started, I just wanted to understand what researchers were doing. I certainly didn't think I'd be contributing anything. I just was more of a curiosity. I'm someone who can be driven by curiosity, and I wanted to know what do they know about cancer research, so that I would, if someone wanted to talk about cancer, I would know. It turned out to be a much bigger project than I ever envisioned, and at the end, I think I contributed something important. And the researchers in the cancer project said, okay, so are we doing this conference every year? Are you going to host us in Halifax? Because we went kayaking. Because we love to come to Halifax, a beautiful city. And are you going to keep doing this cancer work? And I said, well, no, I think I've got a neuroscience project I want to do. And it was, again, because I felt like, okay, I thought there was something I could contribute that would be valuable. Sure. And when I got this project underway, it was harder than I imagined. It took a lot longer than I had expected. I mean, maybe 5 or 6 years longer. And when it was done, I think what I was struck with was how grateful the researchers were who were involved in the project, who said, we don't get to do this kind of a project normally. How did you get all these people together? How did you make them collaborate in this way? Because we would have never done this under the normal way that we work. We have institutes that have all these different people in it that work in all these different areas, but they don't collaborate in any kind of holistic way on any singular problem. They're all pushing the boundaries in their own little areas of research because that's what we do as PhDs. And I thought that was a bit of a shame that even though in academic reward system, that reviews are not treated with the same gravity as bench research or research that breaks ground as a single researcher who, the Nobel Prize. Nobody's going to win a Nobel Prize for a review, but a review is often an opportunity to take stock of all the work that's being done and to bring those pieces together and into focus so that we can understand what happens next. And in my opinion, there's not enough, I don't want to say there's not enough reviews, but even the reviews that are done are often narrow because we have a lot of research. So we do like a review on one little area. And I'm saying, well, who then is responsible for doing the bigger review? How does that happen? And so in my case, I was motivated to do something that I thought was needed and that would matter. And I could see in effective neuroscience a deficit or a lack that was what I saw had happened in cancer research and what a transformative capacity a single model had on the field to help them understand cancer. And I feel like the work that is done by psychiatrists in general and in the clinic with patients who are troubled, the work is so important, and yet this research is still, the field of research in my mind which is all good research, highly valuable, hasn't been pulled together into some kind of coherence, and I felt like I could make a difference, and so that's kind of where I focused. Now, when this was over and I finished the publication, I'm older than 60, so I'm starting to think about, you know, what am I doing with my time? Where am I putting my academic energies, to your point? Do I consider myself an academic now? I was really thinking more in practical terms about bigger problems that we have, climate change, the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, inequality that we experience in the world, global poverty, hunger, food, migration issues, all these things that we know the world is in strife in so many places right now. What do I do, if anything, that can help that? And what I realized is that, certainly from my own experience, that putting together a large network of researchers who could focus on a problem in some kind of holistic way with interdisciplinary inputs is not something that happens readily. So I did a conference a couple of summers ago where I hosted a group of people and said, why isn't this happening? We presented on our own experience. I talked about my experience in these projects, and they shared their experiences doing projects with large groups and why it was or wasn't happening. And what we discovered, or at least the sort of discussion we had, was that in most universities, the VP research is basically a recruiter whose goal it is get the top scientists into their institution so that they have the highest impact research for their institution. That's the reward system. That's where the money is. That's where the grants are. That's where the funding comes. So it's all about getting top talent. The VP International is all about student and faculty mobility, but the VP International or the Senior International Officer doesn't focus on research because that's not their ground, right? Get out of research because now you're impeding on the VP researcher's job. And they don't necessarily talk. It's like International Office has one function, VP Research is another. So if the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation says, for example, we have $30 million to help solve this problem on the continent of Africa, and some school that has really good researchers in that area says, oh, maybe we could secure some of that funding because we've got really top talent that could do that, then who then recruits all the people that are going to help them do that research in a localized and culturally sensitive fashion that allows them to gather the information they need in a way that matters? And how do we contribute to the research capacity in all those institutions that aren't as strong but still have something really important to offer in areas that are in need? And the answer was, there isn't somebody who does that. The VP research doesn't do that because they go to maybe their top researcher and say, who do you know in your network? And they're not going to come up with an interdisciplinary team. They're going to say, well, I've collaborated with so-and-so in this place and that place. And so if they write for the grant, for example, they don't have the system in place to make that happen. And on the other hand, if they go to the VP International or the Senior International Officer and say, can you help us? They say, well, you know, we don't, that's not what we're set up to do. So I held a meeting last month in the University of Toronto where we brought a bunch of people together to lay the foundations for this network, and I'm hoping to hold another meeting in Senegal in Africa to host a bunch of countries, people from researchers from different countries in Africa, and possibly then one in Nepal later in Southeast Asia, with the idea of starting to build kind of a grassroots foundation of strong research institutions that agree that having a network that's focused on the ability to assemble large teams to solve complex problems quickly and having a method to do that, et cetera, is a place where I can make an impact. Now, I can't foresee any peer-reviewed publications that are obviously going to emerge from that. So to answer your question about whether or not I see myself as an academic, probably nobody is going to hire me to do that because there's no publications forthcoming. but I do think it's a place where I can make an impact that will have help us make the world a better place. And for me, if I can make that happen, I'll be satisfied. That answers your question.
This is fantastic, and I'm glad I asked my question to get an answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm going to relay a message from Professor Euripides, who's a Vice Chief of our department. He just wanted to apologize for watching your lecture on YouTube, but as one of the leaders of our institution, he wanted to express his gratitude for your excellent presentation and congratulate you on bringing a new perspective to such a relevant topic in our specialty. Says he's always amazed at how someone with a completely different background can look at concepts that are so well established in our field and offer a fresh viewpoint. And in this sense, he found your lecture extremely thought-provoking. He particularly appreciates Lisa Barrett's definition of emotion, which she describes as something that results from the way we give meaning to interoceptive experiences based on our prior experiences. From this perspective, what we conceive as feelings or effects are subcomponents of what we later refer to as emotion. Emotion, incorporating a bit of what you discussed, could be seen as something we feel the need to name when feelings extend beyond the comfort zone you described. In this sense, feelings as subcomponents of our emotions can be described in an unlimited or limited way, depending on our capacity to name them, involving aspects such as language and culture. So do these ideas resonate with you? Can you speak to the microphone?
And her ideas, which are more focused on how our emotions are constructed and cognitive, largely cognitive in nature, and that there's no sort of dedicated emotional circuitry. I think of this as if anybody's read the book, The War of the Soups and the Sparks in neuroscience. If you haven't read the book, I encourage you to get a copy. It's an argument that happened in the peer-reviewed literature and in neuroscience institutes in the early going between the researchers who believed the brain was completely electrical and the researchers who thought that it was driven by chemistry. The war of the soups and the sparks, the soups being the chemists and the sparks being the electrical camps. They held their own conferences. They disparaged each other's work. The scientists who were focused on the electrical system said, all that chemistry stuff is nonsense, and the people who are focused on chemistry said all that other stuff is nonsense. When I talked to Jaak Panksepp, who was often considered a basic emotion theorist because of all the work that he had done on basic circuitry, he would say, if you can inject a particular neurohormone into an animal and get a consistent result, that is some suggested of some dedicated circuitry that's based on neurohormonal responses. If you can electrically stimulate them in certain ways and you can replicate certain things, we know that seeking behavior can be replicated repeatedly, then we know there's some dedicated circuitry there. And this, in some ways, was seen to be at odds with the idea of constructed emotions. But I would say that what's happening in the field is that there's a recognition that, yes, of course, there's neurochemistry that matters. All those, we know from being able to take exogenous drugs, prescription drugs, that we can influence our central nervous system in predictable ways, mostly predictable. We know that certain types of electrical stimulation can give us repeated results. We know that certain survival circuits exist, like the fear system, and many other related systems have their own dedicated physiology, like the other kinds of systems that I talked about in terms of breathing, food, hunger, etc. And of course, yet we agree that there's a lot of what happens emotionally that is constructed, as Lisa Feldman's Barrett work leads us to talk about how much of this is sort of individualized and constructed based on context, And there's a home for all of this under the human affectome. My expectation is that all these lines of research will eventually converge, and we will understand both why her work is important on constructed thought versus why some of that basic research that was done in the early days about circuitry that exists, why it is important as well.
Any other questions? Of course. Can you give him the microphone, please?
Thank you for the thoughtful presentation. Very interesting. I'm not from the field of neuroscience, so I'm so out of the field as you are. I enjoyed your comparison with cancer research. This is my area of my comfort zone, if you will. And one thing we observed in the Hallmark's paper, it was a very interesting initiative that Weinberg and their group had to create the neuristics model to push forward the advancements. They did a very interesting systematic revision of 30 years of knowledge, as you know. And I think it was so successful because they could integrate the phenome that is actually actionable. So if it weren't actionable, probably that if all those points weren't actionable, I guess they wouldn't be so successful. So in that regard, can you imagine how the human affectome could be actionable in terms of, for example, understanding the behavior that we have right now in terms of the reactions of the public reaction and around misinformation? Can you use the human affectome to create preventive measurements to
I think
disinformation?
from my perspective, this idea of a single stress axis, which is sort of widely accepted, and a single reward system, which is widely accepted, and a single system related to things that are create aversive behaviors, the displeasure system, if you will. These pieces are there. They exist in the literature. But no one, from what I can tell, acknowledges that those common pieces are invoked around comfort zones in all these areas of concern yet. And it would change the way we might approach even our research. So I will read research papers that I see where people are measuring a bunch of different variables, psychological, psychobiological research about what are we measuring in the brain and what's happening, et cetera. And without kind of a baseline model, there is a tendency to measure the things that can be measured or that have been measured before, but without maybe a focus on what does this mean and how might we apply this similarly across many other areas that are presumably using the same machinery, if I can use the term machinery. So in my mind, what's happened in the field of affective neuroscience is that there is no understanding of how all those areas are being similarly managed. And if there was an understanding that they were all being managed similarly, it would create more of a systems way of approaching something. We might expect if we stack a certain number of variables together, we're going to get a certain result. But if we don't have a systems view of the world to start with, we don't have research that reflects on the systems understanding of the world. The field is not there yet. And what I have described today even extends beyond what was in the paper we produced as a group, which was as far as we got. And my co-authors, the two leads of this paper would say, you're pushing us into space where we don't have peer-reviewed research to support this understanding of how things are, and I agree. I think I could propose how things are working in this manner, but we're not there yet, and it's probably a 20-year career in a lab with a lot of people around me to try and make that case. I'm trying to show where I think this leads us. Today, I think a lot of what I shared today is not new science. It's not. It's me trying to draw the pieces into a picture that is relatable to the science that exists, if that makes sense. So the actionability, to come back to your point, might not be quite there yet. And I mean, if anything, what I challenge the people here, who many of whom have their own interest in research or even in how to treat or deal with patients, is to use this as a framework to think about the challenges that you're facing with the patients that you have. If you have a disordered sense of the world, what does ordered look like? And hopefully this provides perhaps some clarity as to what ordered looks like. I mean, we know what normal looks like, but do we understand it neurobiologically? What does ordered look like? And I'm hoping that this helps shape that.
Thank you so much, Professor. We are a little bit past our time already, so we won't be taking any further questions, but in the name of our psychiatry department, I wanted to thank you so much, and thank you, Professor Bozzato, for arranging this meeting as well. It's been a pleasure, and I guess if anyone has any further questions, you can take it in person here. Sure. Thank you so much.